Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Tina. I'm delighted to be here. And I've actually scripted this thing out, so I'm going to allude to this, to what I've written. To start with, I want to say that the title of this presentation, Peter Canby on Truth, is profoundly intimidating to me. And it made me think immediately, and I was trying to think, who is the sports figure that was called The Truth? And The Truth is Carl the Truth Williamson, who is a heavyweight boxer. And in 1989, Carl the Truth Williamson went up against Mike Tyson and got knocked out in the first round, before some people said he even threw a punch. So I have something to hope that I can better. Before Tina reached out and asked if I could make this presentation, I had attended a book event quite recently, like a month ago or something, and the author said something that just really intrigued me. She said, while she was working on this book, which is a combination of fact and fiction book about John Wilkes Booth, the guy who assassinated Abraham Lincoln, she said she had decided that there wasn't anything that was true. I mean, she was kind of wrestling with this idea of inventing characters based on slim evidence. But then over the course of working on that book, she'd come to sort of regret that feeling about there being no single truth. And I think that overhanging that point that she made is the idea that all of us have, that the idea of truth, that when all opinions are equal and you defer to any opinion might be as good as your opinion, it kind of opens the door to election deniers and to QAnon people and people who maybe are less finicky than you are about asserting their own idea of what's true and what's not true. So, as Tina mentioned, I ran the fact-checking department at The New Yorker for quite a few years. I left 2 years ago, just because I felt I'd been there for a while and it was time for what I think of as my next adventure. And I am grateful to Tina for linking to this piece that's actually coming out in the New York Review of Books today. It's a very dark exploration of the politics of death squads and corruption and violence in Guatemala. And years ago, I lived in Chiapas and wrote a book about the present-day Maya indigenous people and traveled a lot at that point in Guatemala. So I feel very attached to that country and that part of the world. But to those of you who are unfamiliar with the process of checking, or at least as we practice it at the New Yorker, I often, people who aren't familiar with that often think that the differences, there are sharp differences between facts and opinions. That facts are like historical facts and scientific facts that checkers can, make sure are right or wrong, and that opinions are the province of editors and writers. And in fact, we spent much more of our time dealing with what I think of as fact-based opinions, which is if somebody has an opinion, it should be a well-informed opinion. It should be one that's informed by the underlying facts. So it was up to checkers really to look critically at the arguments that people were making and try to figure out to whatever degree they were valid. And this had to do with both writers and editors, and it also had to do with the sources we were dealing with. And that's not necessarily a very easy project. And if a checker found that something was arguably inaccurate, then it was their job to come up with some kind of a formulation that would really adjust the text that we were working on to the lack of understanding of the underlying material. And that involved, for checkers, it involved a couple of things. And one is making seamless fixes in documents, in things that we're about to publish, so that I would urge them to look at the erroneous material and use it like a junkyard of parts and make I wanted them to work on what I called their batting average, which is to say that you want to make a change that fits exactly into the part of a piece that you feel needs changing, and you want to echo the prose of the guy that wrote it or the person that wrote it, and you want to make it generally a seamless repair. And if your batting average is perfect, you bat 1,000, then the editor takes your change exactly the way it is. And I never wanted checkers to be particularly humble about this approach, and I talked to them a lot about approaching power from a point of view of relative powerlessness. In other words, you have to figure out how to get where you want to get by managing people who are above you in a hierarchy. I'm not a huge believer in hierarchy, but hierarchies exist. So that was kind of the essence of a lot of what we did in checking. And we didn't gratuitously write people's opinions, rewrite them. We would consult with them. We would talk to them about the changes we want to make. We would never make changes without talking to both the writer and the editor and about negotiating the transaction. And that, in a way, is something I want to come back to later, that we had an underlying idea that some ideas, even though maybe no single idea is absolutely true, that we think that some ideas are stronger than others, and we wanted the New Yorker's pieces to be based on the most accurate understanding of whatever we were discussing as could be. So that's I want to talk about a couple of checking basics so that you understand the kind of approach that we took to this material that we worked on. We would start with sending out a fierce-sounding memo to all writers, telling them, and that came with my name on it, telling them that they had to provide us with the contact information for all the sources that they used, and we would want to speak to pretty much everybody. And if there were writers who, for example, said, well, you can't talk to that person because that person's too sensitive a source, or that this person will completely flip if he or she knows what we're alleging about him, then that would be a real red flag for us. And we would naturally start strategizing for ways to speak to that person. And it's not something that we would just blindly do. We wouldn't just call up the person and say, by the way, we're saying this terrible thing about you. What do you think? We would talk to the writer and to the editor, and we were particularly strong on people whose opinions and feelings were characterized by other people. So if you're saying something about somebody and you would say, I can't believe what this person did or said, but they didn't want to talk to that person because it was too sort of damaging, then we would try to reach out to that person, and we would strategize with the writer and editor and say, who wants to make this first call to that person? But that's really part of our process, and that was pretty much accepted at the New Yorker. And it would take a while for people to work up their confidence to make those kind of calls, so we would typically start checkers on smaller, less ambitious pieces where there could be less damage done. Some of the pieces that we worked on had 50 or 60 sources. I mean, Jane Mayer, for example, who's one of our just supremely talented investigative reporters, I mean, she seldom did a piece that had less than 50 or 60 people that she'd spoken with, at least at one of her big print pieces. And we would try to talk to all of them. And before we talked to them, so we got from Jane, we got from all the writers, we got their notes and their sources and their transcripts. So before we would call people, we would know pretty much what they had said, because we would look at their notes. And then if that person began to backpedal, when the checkers contacted them, then we would say, look, we know what you said because we have the notes. So we're asking you to fix information that's wrong and not to retract what you said. And that allowed us to get pretty close to a lot of sources. And you might think of this as just a process of unnecessary redundancy, but the checkers, find out a lot of stuff, and they put fine points and fine twists on information that really makes the stuff come alive. Well, it's alive to begin with, but it makes it what makes the New Yorker famous for the quality of its reporting. So checking and reporting are very closely related to each other. when people started retracting what they said, we called that source remorse. We had a term for it. And I often, another one of my bromides that I was constantly inflicting on the people who worked for me was the notion of controlled explosions, which is kind of implicit in everything I've been talking about so far, is that if there's going to be an explosion going off because of something we wrote, we wanted it to happen before publication and not after. And so that meant that we just had to sort of take a deep breath and make that controversial call. And oftentimes you would make one of these kind of ridiculous phone sequences where you start with softball questions. Sometimes you even invent softball questions to sort of get the person talking with you. And then you say, by the way, and then you hit the controlled explosion part and they go, what? And so that's when you say, I have the notes, I know what you said. And then if they hang up on you, you quickly call the writer and say, you're about to get an angry phone call from somebody. And usually you're able to get to the writer before they are. So they're kind of forewarned. There were a lot of reasons for talking to all subjects, many of which I've just gone through, but one of the, what I think of almost like a weird one, because it's weird because it has to do with my own preferences and my own feelings, it's a courtesy. And I worked closely with my boss, David Remnick, and Remnick agreed, and I agreed on most things, but not all things. And one of the things that he agreed on was that if somebody's going to appear in the New Yorker, we want to call them and let them know. So even if there's nothing about anybody that's controversial, you want to call that person just as a courtesy to them, to let them know that they're about to appear in print. And David was also big on that. And I can't say that we always did it, but from my point of view, it goes along with my idea that that fact-checking is a kind of moral act in the sense that it respects other people's points of view, and it's interested in hearing out other people's points of view, and it believes in an underlying idea that there's, if not an absolute truth, then an arguable truth for any particular thing that you're dealing with. So it isn't infrequent for checkers to become, it wasn't infrequent for checkers to become friendly with people that they spoke with. And we had a writer, Andrew Morantz, we have a writer. Actually, when I say we, I just want to point out to you that it's 2 years since I've been at the New Yorker, and I'm in constant contact still with people there, but it's you'll forgive me if I use this we, because I still identify strongly with the place. But Andrew worked a lot. He wrote a lot about kind of right-wing ranters, and the checkers would call the right-wing ranters, and quite often they found them to be, I mean, this is a kind of a gross generality, but there were a lot of sort of lonely people living in basements, sometimes metaphorically or literally, of their parents' houses. And when the checkers called them, they were really happy to talk. And it got to the point where, well, let me just talk about one of those people was Julian Assange. And the New Yorker wrote an early piece about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and it was written by Rafi Kachadurian. And Rafi was a guy that was a checker and that I hired originally, and he worked for me for a couple of years, and he's gone on to become a very talented writer. And Rafi wrote the original piece on Julian Assange, and he also wrote a follow-up piece when Julian Assange was in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. And the access to, Julian Assange, who was living essentially in like a coat closet in the embassy, was difficult. And we had negotiated a way to get questions to him. And Rafi, as a former checker, maybe felt that was a bit redundant, but we figured out a way to get our sort of highlighted checking questions to Julian Assange, and we thought we were done. But Julian Assange said, I'm not going anywhere until I get my conversation with a fact checker. So he kind of felt that he was entitled to talk to the checker. So we set that up. And, it went well enough. I've forgotten what came out of it. But I think that, I don't want to be judgmental one way or another. I don't know what you all feel about Julian Assange, but he strikes me as a bit of a narcissist. And I think he also, living in the Ecuadorian embassy for as long as he did, he felt like talking to people. So he had multiple motives for talking to checkers. So another thing that Remnick and I agreed on, and Remnick was even stronger on this than I was, when you sit down you've got a source, you've got just a ton of stuff to go over with a person, there's an impulse to just sit down and tap out a bunch of emailed questions. And Remnick and I were both really strong on the idea that it's better for you as a checker to talk to the source than it is to just email a bunch of questions to the person. You could see why in some ways it's easier to do the email questions because you don't have to deal with the complexities of what people actually feel and what their answers might be. But we wanted that human interaction, and I can't say that I'm about to give you an example of what happens when that wasn't possible, but let me not get ahead of myself and just say that we both felt that human interaction was a really central part of not just the fact-checking process, but the editorial process generally, is you want to hear the full complexities of somebody, and you learn things from going back and forth with people that you don't learn from asking them just a question in an email, because if it's a sensitive piece, they can give you kind of indirect, unsatisfactory answers to an email, which is harder to do when they're talking to you person to person. And these were complicated people. So I want to offer you an example of how complicated a conversation can get, a face-to-face, in-person conversation. Actually, not face-to-face because this was over a phone. A year or two before I left, I actually didn't even look up the date of this because it doesn't really matter. We ran a long piece about Alan Dershowitz, and he is the former Harvard Law professor and I guess TV celebrity lawyer, and he also was part of the legal team of the sex abuser Joseph Epstein. So the piece that we wrote about him was a long investigative piece that we refer to as a write-around. And write-around in my business anyway means that the main source wouldn't speak to you. And he probably had good reason to think that this would not be a friendly piece, and so he just basically shut the writer down. And the writer dealt with everybody that he knew and called as many friends, but the piece we got to us hadn't she hadn't been able to reach Dershowitz, and that was intentional on his part. But when it came to checking, Dershowitz I think he knew enough about the checking process that he came to realize that was his best chance to find out what the New Yorker was saying about him. And he also, my guess is, knowing him, I obviously don't know him personally, is that he felt he could possibly intimidate the checkers. And in this one, he was wrong, because there were 3 really high-level checkers. Everything we did got put in at the last minute, and this was maybe a 10,000-word piece. I don't specifically remember. And so he made a phone date with the checkers, and he had a tape recorder running, and they had tape recorders running. There were 3 of them. They spent 7 hours on the phone with Dershowitz. I think they broke up the call into 3 parts. It might even have been 9 hours. I don't exactly remember. But they went over every damaging allegation about Dershowitz, and Dershowitz responded, I would say, furiously to each of those allegations. And because it was taped, we got his conversation, his responses on tape, and we got our questions. And in the end, he said, "Okay, smart asses, I'm going to sue you all, and I will see you in court," and even named what court it was going to be. And the thing is, at the beginning of this conversation, mind you, it was 7 or 9 hours, whatever it was, over one very long day, they had made an oral agreement with Dershowitz that everything that went on in that conversation was going to be off the record entirely and not for use. It was just for fact-checking. So by the end of the day, he either deliberately or accidentally had forgotten that agreement and decided that he was going to sue the checkers, which was, I'm going to say for me, kind of darkly hilarious. But so we had to take out a transcript of that agreement that he'd made and said, by the way, Mr. Dershowitz, here's the agreement that you made with the checkers that all this is off the record and only for checking purposes. And he asked us to send back that agreement, which we did, and then we CC'd our lawyer on it. So that kind of ended the project of suing the fact checkers. So I'm telling you all this because I just want to make the point that these conversations can get like really complicated. And the Himalayan mountains of complicated pieces was not the Dershowitz piece, of which there are many ones in different ways like that, but a 30,000-word piece that Larry Wright did a number of years ago, I think quite a few years ago, about Scientology. And so you remember in the beginning, Remnick's and my strong feeling that we preferred speaking with sources in person. Scientology, when we first approached them, shut us down on that, and they said, we're not talking to anybody. We'll only respond to what you send to us in writing. So the checker then took a couple of weeks and wrote out 938 checking questions for Scientology. And she was going to, at the point of sending them, when she brought them by for me to look at them, and Remnick looked at them at that point, and he thought, this is ridiculous. This is like a parody of the kind of process that we have. But we persuaded him that there really wasn't any other way to do this. Scientology is an extremely litigious organization with a bundle of money. I think it's more than $1 billion in effectively a legal defense fund. And they had tied up Time magazine in the courts for 15 years. And mind you, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding was the case they had against Time magazine was not a strong case, but they had enough money to keep it in the courts for all that time. So we were mindful of this, and we felt that the 938 questions was the best approach that we could take. So it had a surprising outcome, the 938 questions, and what it was is that it brought Scientology to the table, and it brought them to the table literally as well as figuratively. And they responded by sending 4 lawyers and 3 publicists and 47 boxes of documents. And none of us really wanted the Scientology people. They came to New York. They came to the New Yorker's offices with this stuff, and they were going to go over each of the 938 questions in a conference room. And I remember holding the door for them as they streamed in, and there were all these sort of gray-suited figures and lawyers and pushing carts with boxes in them. And I said to one of them, I said, well, my arm is getting tired holding the door for you all. And there was a pretty high-end First Amendment lawyer named Tony Glassman who was part of their team. And I'm sure it wasn't his favorite job, but that was his job. And he said to me, don't worry, we're going to take your arm off soon enough. And they all sort of went, ha, ha, ha. So I took that to be lawyer humor. So we'd gone upstairs to a conference room that wasn't part of the New Yorker, and we spent 8 hours in what I think of as a smackdown with the 7 Scientology representatives and Larry Wright, who was the author of this piece, his editor, Daniel Zaleski, Remnick, myself, and the 3 checkers who were at that point on that job. And many of the answers to their questions, we would ask something, the way you ask these questions, you have to look critically at what kind of responses they elicit. The questions did not, they were meant to elicit specific responses, and they would respond true or not true. Which wasn't useful for us, but for the most part. But it became apparent that they had an obsession with people who had left Scientology, and were speaking badly about it. And they called these people bitter apostates. And they spent an awful lot of time running down bitter apostates in the middle of the conference table. They'd have photographs and they would make disparaging comments. And we picked up all this stuff. And our checker, maybe, I can't remember whether she had already gotten, our lead checker, whether she had already gotten onto this or not, but the bitter apostates had chat rooms in which they were saying things about Scientology that the checker and then Larry Wright got into, and we picked up a lot of material that way. So at the end of the day, I think Scientology thought that they had really crushed us by their non-response, but in fact, we had picked up a lot of material that allowed us to elaborate on what we already had. And so then Larry was able to turn out another version of the piece, which we ran a few months later. And eventually there were 5 checkers on it, which is, I think, possibly the most I've ever used. But the main checker who worked on it for 6 months was a woman named Jennifer Stahl, who was a real star. And Jen, well, anyway, she was really terrific, and I think for the New Yorker to have devoted the kind of resources that they did to this project was a real credit to the magazine. The story was not, I guess you would say, favorable to Scientology, and I think they would love to have sued us, but one of the main definitions of libel is a reckless disregard for truth, and the fact that we had sent, despite the mixed feelings that people had internally at the New Yorker about sending 938 questions about anything, it demonstrated just the opposite of a reckless disregard for truth, because we were very interested in their responses. And they gave us, obstructionist responses, but they responded. And they, their only response was not a libel suit, but on the day that issue of the New Yorker came out, they appeared at, a bunch of Scientologists appeared outside the Condé Nast building. Condé Nast is our parent organization. And they'd made a copy of their own magazine, I've forgotten the name of it, which had disparaging comments on Larry's piece and kind of dolled up ludicrous photographs of all of us in it. And they handed it out to, including myself, and that they'd plucked off the internet. They handed it out to anybody that was willing to look at it. So I still have mine in a box somewhere. Larry's piece circulated widely and won a National Magazine Award, and then he subsumed it in a larger book. At the New Yorker, so I've been talking to you about complicated reporting pieces. We also check everything else in the New Yorker, including humor pieces. You can ask about these later if you're curious about how we check humor pieces. Fiction, poetry, art, radio, video, and my favorite, cartoons. And so that may raise questions about how you check a cartoon. But when I started at the New Yorker, which was a long time ago, there was really only a weekly print magazine. And now there is not just a digital site which kicks up a regular, every single day, a large number of new copy, but also a lot of other aspects. There's a radio, there's video. They're doing everything they need to do to be a kind of existing media, product in a competitive and difficult environment. And among other things, that's changed the way it's the size of the checking department, even since I was there 2 years ago, has grown greatly. I'm not even going to give you numbers because I never even really know how many checkers there are. But the reason for that is that when they post things on the digital site, they don't want to have to wait in line. I mean, they believe in the value of checking for editorial purposes at the New Yorker, but they don't want to have to wait in line. They want to turn the thing around and post it as quickly as they can, which is part of the nature of digital journalism. So there are more checkers than there used to be. There are also new ways that we've had to adjust to in the ways that, or they've had to adjust to in the ways that people communicate with each other, and the way that sources push back to us. And One of the most egregious of this examples of this is one that's been quite widely publicized, and that's Ronan Farrow's pieces on Harvey Weinstein. And so Ronan brought that piece to the New Yorker when he was already working on it, as I'm sure you know. And he started having the sense that somebody was following him, and somebody was always parked outside his house. And so then it turned out that people were following and also the people who were Harvey Weinstein's victims. And there were people who insinuated themselves into their private lives and pretended to be sympathetic friends. And it all got and was getting like really weird. And then somebody from an organization called Black Cube in London started leaking material to us. And Black Cube is a disruptor organization that you use for your political opponents or your journalistic opponents that makes their lives. It just tries to mess with their lives. So one of the things that was leaked to us was, and this is all in Ronan's book, by the way, so I'm not telling you anything new, but one of the things that was leaked to us was a contract signed by Harvey Weinstein's lawyer, David Boies, for $600,000 to pay Black Cube for their disruption of Harvey Weinstein's people who were complaining about him. And we asked David Boies about that, America's lawyer, and this is all in the book, which is why I'm telling you this. The book is called Catch and Kill. And he said, oh no, I'd never heard of Black Cube. And then we said, that's funny, we've got a document here with your signature on it for a $600,000 payment. And he said, oh yeah, I guess I did know about Black Cube, didn't I? And so he retracted his denial. And so that was one thing. That was kind of, and unfortunately more widespread phenomenon in the world of kind of controversial investigative journalism these days, is that there are people who actively work to disrupt you and chase down the details of journalists' lives. And there's software for that called Pegasus. And in fact, it just turned out that I think the CIA said they looked at Pegasus, but only to look at how it worked. And there was another incident that has to do with new technology that I think is kind of interesting, is possibly worth sharing, is that Condé Nast tried to migrate, or did migrate its information systems from Microsoft Office or Microsoft Outlook or whatever it was to Google. Can you tell I'm not very high tech? And they sent a salesperson along, and the salesperson made a pitch that was all about sort of pastel colors and all about new ways to share information and new ways for people to cooperate to each other. And in a funny way, in my world, which I've already described to you as one that's not all about happy people always getting along with each other, this seemed more, in a way that a lot of tech stuff is, it seems, or a lot of tech pitches anyway, because tech is neutral, tech itself, the pitches seem possibly more appropriate for 7-year-olds or 9-year-olds than cynical journalists. And mind you, when I say cynical, I should actually say skeptical, because I don't think of myself as a cynical person. I mean, I'll let you judge that for yourselves. But I think of myself as a highly skeptical and a very rational person, but not a cynical person. But our lawyer, a terrific lawyer named Fabio Bertoni. Am I going on too long, Tina? Okay. Let me wind this down. I'm coming to the end of it, and I might even skip my last anecdote. But our lawyer looked at the Google people and said, what happens when you delete things? And the guy said, it goes to the cloud, and it's safe there. And then it turns out that the cloud, nothing is ever deleted in the cloud. And then I was going to tell you about a case where the FISA courts, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act courts, did a warrantless investigation of a New York Times reporter, and they looked at 2 years of her Google emails without her knowing about it. So we kept Microsoft Outlook for the checkers, which allowed our lawyer to protect material. So before I sign off, I just want to go back and talk a little bit about what this has to do with truth, and then I'm going to take some questions. We operated for editorial purposes on the idea that some arguments are better than others, that there's no absolute truth, but that there is a responsibility to be mindful of different arguments that are out there. And there's nothing particularly radical about that. That's the way science happens. That's the way knowledge happens generally. But it involves a certain amount of obligation to be confidential to be confident and to work hard. In the internet, there's a lot of siloed information in a way that probably wasn't much of an issue until the internet was invented, which is to say that you can get into a silo and you can just have entirely self-reinforcing information in it, and you can come out and believe some really wacky things. And so that's a social problem. It's a journalistic problem, but it's a social problem as well. We tried to penetrate that by just asking questions and speaking to people, and I think that that's really, when we're dealing with a global problem of defining truth, what we're really talking about is the need for a dialogue between people. And in a funny way, the internet makes that more possible and less possible at the same time. And the amount of information is completely overwhelming, but the obligation to be skeptical about it and to demand some kind of truth, if not in an absolute sense, then at least the sense of a viable argument based on scientific or factual evidence behooves us more than ever. So that's, I think that I've probably exceeded my time. And when I read this at home to my wife, I had to tell you she fell asleep. And I probably, because she's heard me talking about this for years, and I read it probably more quickly than with fewer digressions than I've done with you. And it came out 18 minutes, so I suspect I'm up to 25 minutes, and thank you very much.